Our job is to give our students the necessary tools to become transformative humans in their time. People evolve, societies evolve, things change. Is our education system outdated? Does it need to be revised? At the time of birth, some of us are more privileged than others. How has our education system really been designed, and who was it really created for?
One of the challenges in figuring out how to talk about educational inequality in Nashville is figuring out where to start. And I would suggest that we really need to reach back quite far.
In the 19th century, Nashville's population had two groups of people, white and black. Whites made up about 75% of the population. African Americans made about 25% of the population. Because of laws in the South, including Nashville, it was illegal to teach African Americans to read and write. When the Civil War was over, there was this new era that a lot of people needed to be educated quickly, and they needed to be educated at once. Although one of the nicknames of the city was always the Athens of the South, it could have easily been called the African American Athens of the South. Nashville was very fortunate to have 5 institutions of higher learning and graduate schools. African Americans experienced a lot of successes in Nashville, and all of that was going very well until the Jim Crow laws of the 1890s.
It is a way to put African Americans back in their place. In many ways, Tennessee becomes a model for other states in the South.
The state of Tennessee made it illegal to educate African Americans and whites in the same classroom anywhere in the state. And it was during this time the inequities started to really show. A white school might get, a large teaching staff and a building and better grounds. The African American schools were smaller and more modest, and the materials that they had were often used hand-me-down books and supplies that the white schools had discarded. And that was the difference, that literally the Plessy versus Ferguson United States Supreme Court decision ruled that separate was equal, and it clearly was not equal in Tennessee.
If you're talking about a growing city in the 1920s and the 1930s, you're talking about a place where people are trying to figure out what the future is going to look like. And especially white elite business members are interested in organizing the city in ways that are going to serve their interests. So the City Planning Commission is involved in mapping the city. They had to decide whether they wanted to encourage the neighborhoods to continue to exist as they did, or whether they wanted to try to change them. And urban renewal and public housing construction and decisions about where to build schools or other facilities were all connected to their interest in changing who lived where in the city. They thought the appropriate neighborhood unit was one that was people of quote-unquote similar ethnic groups. If you were to look at the East Nashville geography, you'd see city planners talking about how around Warner School, they were going to think of that as a white school that would have white residential development around it. And on the other side of Main Street, they would see Meigs School, which was a segregated black school, and they would think about planning public housing for black residents on that side of the street. They thought they could use the combination of housing and schooling to draw a line of segregation in East Nashville. They were binding together segregation in housing, segregation in schooling, and segregation in the very concepts of how people understood the city.
The Brown versus Board of Education famous Supreme Court decision came out in 1954. The very next year in Nashville, Tennessee, our schools were 100% white and 100% black. It's almost like the decision didn't happen or nobody in Nashville had ever heard of Brown.
It takes local families and local attorneys deciding to ask the local courts to make Brown happen in their community. Z. Alexander Luby and Avon Williams had to locate local families who were willing to try to make Brown happen in Nashville. A.Z. Kelly was a barber in East Nashville. He had several children, and one of them was named Robert. And Robert was about to enter high school, and he lived closest to East High School in East Nashville. But Robert was a black student, and East High School was a historically segregated white school. And when Robert tried to enroll at East, he was told he had to go to Pearl, which was the city high school for black students at the time.
So in 1955, again, Luby and Avon Williams filed suit. It was Kelly versus Board of Education of Nashville to begin the desegregation of the school system here in Nashville. That case is the longest running school desegregation case in the nation. That case was not ultimately settled until 1998.
The city came up with a plan to comply with Brown. And the Nashville plan basically would be a stair-step plan of gradually integrating the schools, starting at first grade and doing that grade 1 year, and then second grade the next year.
It took a very long time, fully 12 years beyond the Brown decision. And at that point, there's still very, very few of Nashville's children overall who are attending desegregated schools.
Nashville was a divided city, and probably even more than who got to sit next to each other at a movie theater or at a lunch counter or on a bus, the number one pushback for integration was who got to sit next to your kid in a classroom.
Resistance to desegregation in the 1950s came from so many different corners in Nashville. It's true that quote-unquote outside agitators like John Casper came to town and helped organize really aggressive, vocal, sometimes quite violent resistance to desegregation. But it's also true that the resistance of someone like Cecil Sims, a local lawyer who said, well, we don't have to protest, we can just use zoning to avoid desegregation, should count as resistance as well. So school board member Cecil Sims, who was a local attorney, one of his contributions to how the city would respond to Brown was the idea that you could use zoning as a way to avoid desegregation. This was what Sims called intelligent zoning. And what he meant was that if you recognized that the city was a residentially segregated city, you could create school zone lines where you would maximize the number of black children in the zone for a given school, you'd maximize the number of white children in the zone for another school, and thereby you could say that you had desegregated those schools because they were open to all the children who lived in that zone. And Sims does that with the power of the local elite, with the power of a school board seat. And so we've got to think about resistance not just in terms of angry white parents marching under the banner of a KKK sign, which certainly happened, but also respected city leaders, overwhelmingly white men, using their power to slowly and quietly stall and avoid desegregation.
September 9th, 1957 is one of the most significant days in Nashville history. It is on that day, because of a court order, that African American students, escorted by their parents and protected by local police, went to a white school for the first time.
I had my big pencil in my hand, had my notebook in the other hand. I was smiling.
My grandmother made me a beautiful purple lilac dress with plaits, and so I was excited. I was ready to go. We walked up to Cleveland Street and turned left. When we turned left, there was all these people.
Well, on the picture, it's me, Linda's mother, her name was Grace, and her daughter, Linda, and a bunch of people hollering and yelling with signs, niggas go home. I thought I belonged there with all the other kids, but, other people saw it different.
My dad was a farmer prior to going to the war. When I look at myself as a 6-year-old in pictures, my father is looking ahead. He was leading by example of how he wanted me to be calm, not fearful, because I was going to school, and that was the emphasis.
At night, there was an explosion, big explosion. We could hear it. We could, you could feel it. In one of the schools, one of the brand new schools, was blown up. Hattie Cotton. Only one little girl was going there. Only one little girl. And they blew up that brand new school.
They didn't think we would last a week or even 6 months. But we went, Marvin and I, we went all the way to the 6th grade.
It pulled back a peel of the onion that revealed that Nashville was really not as progressive in race relations as it perceived itself to be.
In 1963, the city and the county are consolidated, and that means that now there's Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools, bringing together the former City of Nashville schools and the former Davidson County into one school district.
African Americans were leery of consolidation. One thing, consolidating the city and the county, obviously it would make the white population larger.
In the first few years of Nashville's consolidated government, the Metropolitan School Board had only one Black representative. And that one representative, Isaiah Creswell, was a persistent advocate for Nashville's Black students. But because the board was appointed, and because the mayor at the time was choosing to put predominantly white Nashville residents on the board, Creswell was in some ways the only representative of Black Nashville in that policymaking body. The general question here is who gets to make decisions about the city schools? So under court order in 1971, Nashville starts moving children from schools that usually were closer to their home to others that were often farther away to achieve the court-required ratio of Black students to white students in each school.
Busing provided a balance that would have never naturally occurred because the neighborhoods that all these schools were in were practically all one race or another.
In 1971, they closed most of the elementary schools in the inner city. For example, the one I went to was Fort Greene, but they closed just about all of those schools. And so the African-American kids, the younger kids in the community were bussed out.
We would get up at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, and be out there to catch a bus to ride 30 minutes to another school when we could literally walk to our neighborhood schools. It was a negative environment. We felt we were in hostile territory. They really didn't want us out there. And I sure as to God did not want to be out there. Our teachers didn't come with us.
Pearl was a historically Black school, which had been drawing teenagers from all over Nashville. But under the desegregation order, Pearl was supposed to attract a majority of white students and had a zone that was inclusive of predominantly white neighborhoods. But many, many white parents whose children were zoned to Pearl did not send them there. The Board of Education began talking about closing Pearl.
The community became an outrage over trying to make an attempt to close Pearl High because it was our family, it was our home. And we knew that by the closure of this building, this school, we would no longer have any history.
Local advocates who argued for Pearl to stay open talked very clearly about how urban renewal and highway construction and public housing construction, as well as unequal busing, had felt like it was taking things away from Nashville for years. And taking Pearl away was one more insult in that long history of not only failing to invest sufficiently in Black neighborhoods, but actively removing resources from those communities. The Chamber of Commerce in the early 1990s commissioned a study about what would help Nashville grow more. This theme of how to make the city grow keeps coming back. And one of the things that they heard was that a strong school system would be an attractive part of recruiting new business. So Nashville leaders were part of arguing that desegregation was an obstacle to the city's growth. That's one argument. Another very different but simultaneous argument was a feeling on the part of Nashville's Black residents that the burdens of desegregation, especially the school closures and the unequally distributed expectations of busing, were no longer worth bearing. And so with their attorneys, the plaintiffs began to talk about negotiating with the school board towards the end of the court order.
And after 43 years of legal motions in front of many judges, the long Kelly case had finally been settled. The date Judge Wiseman settled the federal lawsuit, the plaintiff's attorney, Richard Dinkins, said that desegregation was always about equal access, and that's what this plan was about. But he also warned that there has to be a lot of trust on their side that the politicians and the school board would do all the things they told Judge Wiseman to do so they can get out from under this order.
The school system, in negotiating the end of desegregation, promised to provide more resources to those schools. They thought perhaps that those additional resources would also draw white children into those schools, but most importantly for Black advocates, they promised a big expansion of resources in those schools. And pretty quickly, it became clear that that additional investment was not going to last. It was a commitment that, unlike making a building, required an annual decision to fund. And after not very many years, those additional investments weren't forthcoming. So after 1998, Nashville Public Schools end up with striking resegregation in Central City, predominantly Black and often predominantly poor schools. Failure to consistently invest in additional resources in those schools, and a neighborhood schools approach that's going to allow the development of enclave schools for some middle-class white families, so that there are some places that become very, very segregated white schools at the same time that you have very, very segregated Black schools in the Central City. So that is to say, a lot of the promises on which both the plaintiffs and the city leaders went to achieve unitary status have not come to pass.
I think we thought that we had progressed to the point where equality among the races meant something, that it was a value that we as a country, as a state, as a city, held.
Americans have been really interested in putting huge agendas on schools, on saying schools will fix social problems. They'll fix segregation, for example. They'll fix health crises at times. They'll create economic mobility. And we should notice that our investment in schools to achieve those goals has almost always been smaller than our investment in these big systems that generate the inequality around us. So when we turn to schools to make these major changes, we should ask ourselves, compared to what? Compared to our investment in highways or suburbanization or big new stadiums or economic development agendas? Are we giving schools the resources that they need to accomplish what we say we think they can accomplish?
I think we will always have problems, and I think it takes collective effort. It takes community impact. It takes foundations. It takes the business sector. It takes the faith sector. It takes residents. It takes neighbors. It takes not just those who have children that go to school. It's every single citizen who comes and collectively says, you know what, we really do care and we value education.
Now that we don't have a lawsuit, who is going to advocate? Who is going to put that pressure, not in a courtroom, but the table of brotherhood, that Martin Luther King talked about? That's how it's going to be done. And it's just taking people who are willing to carry the baton into the next generation. And I know Nashville can do what it needs to do. There's no doubt in my mind that it can, if it puts its collective mind to it, that we are truly not going to let children fail.